I'm really happy to be here with you guys tonight. Really excited for you guys to see the videos and the and everything with the chicks. I did have to pre-record this. I live in a very rural area, and my internet isn't always reliable, and so I did pre-record it because I didn't want it to cut in and out or to lag as we were doing the video. But we did pre-record it just a day ago, so everything is really current and up to date. But I did want to let you guys know that. Plus, I am sitting inside the house instead of out at the coop, so you probably would notice that. But I'm really excited for you guys to see this. Please put any of your questions. I tried to answer as many of the pre-submitted questions as we could as I did the webinar. But please put your questions in the chat. We're looking forward to seeing those. We're definitely going to get as many of those as we can answered. And without further ado, we'll go back to Bonnie and she can start the webinar for you guys. Thank you for joining us.
I'm getting it ready.
Yep.
Hi everybody, welcome to our seminar tonight. This seminar is going to focus on rearing baby chicks. So we're going to talk about setup for rearing baby chicks, some tips and hints to have success in that. And then we're going to go out to the coop and I'll show you some really easy ways to introduce new birds to your existing flock. So the first thing we're going to talk about today are baby chicks. So here in this cattle water, this is a cattle water, but for me, it's a brooder box. So really anything can be a brooder box. And when we talk about brooder boxes, this is kind of like the nursery for the baby chicks. I've seen people use old pack and plays, Rubbermaid containers, really anything that's a nice big sturdy box. You probably want to avoid things that are cardboard or might get really wet or start to weaken or weep. So I try to use something that's pretty sturdy like this cattle water. So there are really only a few basic things that you need when you set up your brooder box. So these little babies here, I'll show you the babies if I can get them to come out. These little babies here are about 2 days old, 2 to 3 days old. There are mixed varieties of chicks in here, and we'll talk just a little bit about chicks and the types of chicks. But there are mixed varieties. All of these babies are going to be laying hens. But the nice thing about what we're going to talk about today is if you want to brood ducks, if you want to brood meat birds, turkeys, the setup is really very, very similar. So if you know the basics of brooder box setup, then you can raise any type of poultry that you want. So as I mentioned, these guys are intended to become laying hens. So I'll show you kind of how we set up, or I set up the brooder box when I get started. First thing I do, I put the box where I want it. I'm actually in a workshop. This is my husband's workshop. It's attached to our equipment shed. Some great places to brood chicks would be in a coop that doesn't have any other birds in it. In a workshop like this one, this would be very similar to if you had a garage. You can also brood them inside like a basement or in your house. The detriment to that is there will be some odor from the chicks. So I don't like to brood inside the house. I like to brood outside in a separate area. So this is a workshop. One of the things you'll have to have is access to electricity. So you'll either need a space that actually has electricity or a space where you can safely run extension cords to actually use heat lamps for the birds or to use the heat plate type heaters for the chicks. So first thing I want to talk about is choosing the right type of chick. There are lots of different options out there. Most of the chicks you're going to find if you go to your local farm store are going to be birds that are intended to become laying hens. You will find ducks, you'll find turkeys, guineas, and you'll often find broiler chickens. So just make sure you read the signs and you know exactly what you're picking. If you want chicks that are intended to become laying hens, make sure you pay attention to the signs. Another thing you want to make sure you pay, my cat's meowing. Another thing you want to make sure you pay attention to is the sex of the chicks. So of course you're going to want all females or all pullets if you're intended to have laying hens. Every once in a while there'll be a rooster in the mix, but for the most part those are going to be already sexed as all females. If you see the words straight run or mixed sex, that means you have males and females in the group. And if you're developing a layer flock, you want to go for the females, of course, because they're the ones that are going to lay the eggs. So let's just talk about the basic brooder setup now. Before I went to get these baby chicks, I brought in my brooder box. I put my shavings down. I put my water, my feed, and my heat lamp. Those are really the basic components of what you need for a brooder box. I like to set my brooder box up in zones. So what I do is I have my heat source. In this case, it's a heat lamp. Brooders, if you're raising hundreds or thousands of chicks, brooders that heat the whole room work really well. They also make those ceramic plates that you plug into the wall, and they mimic what it's like for the chicks to get under the wings of the mama bird. So those also work really, really well also. But I have traditionally used heat lamps, and that's what I have here today. So I like to have my warm zone where my heat lamp is. And then I like to set my feed and my water up outside of my warm zone. I don't want my feed and my water directly underneath my heat lamp, because if they get too hot, then the birds are unlikely to eat or drink. And then with water, of course, if it gets too hot, you can have some growth of algae or bacteria in that. So I like to avoid having my water or my feed directly underneath my heat source. So I have a heat source, I have my food, and I have my water. I'm gonna try to do this without spilling. I usually put my water on top of a little piece of wood, like a little piece of OSB or something like that, or I've even used in the past some floor tiles. That just gets it up off of and out of the shavings, so that it doesn't get so dirty. You don't get so many shavings kicked in there, because the waters can be fairly heavy. So when they start to sink down in the shavings, you'll get a lot of that kicked in there. So I like to put it on something that just floats right on top of the shavings. Another thing I like to do is for about 2 or 3 days, when I set this brooder box up, I'll either take paper plates, or in this case, these are just coffee can lids. So I'll take these and I'll put my feed directly on top of that. What that does is when I brought these baby chicks home, I would just put them down right on top of their feed and water. And when you do that, a lot of times they'll start scratching and pecking right away. And when they do that, they're getting on their feed a lot faster. So by putting it out here out in the open, putting the chicks right on top of it, they'll start scratching, pecking, and picking up their feed. And it's a lot easier for them to find their feed in these open sources in those first couple of days. Now, as I'm sure you can tell, there is some waste when you do that. They've kicked out a good bit of this feed here onto the shavings. They will also start to poop in this after a day or two. So I'll only do that for the first couple of days just to make sure those birds are getting on feed. And then I'll switch them over to like a good chick feed or something like this, or those chick feeders that look like the jars with the pans on them. So I'll switch them over to that once I know they're eating. But you'll see them walking across it and getting really curious here in the first couple days and really figuring out that that's their feed, and that helps a lot. Now, one of the really fascinating things about chickens, one of the things that I love the most about chickens, is that these little teeny tiny babies, they only weigh about 50 grams. And they can find their feed, and they can find their water, and they can survive all on their own, with the exception that they cannot regulate their temperature. I find it fascinating that these little tiny babies can survive without a maternal presence. But one thing they cannot do is regulate their temperature. They use their feathers to help regulate their temperature, and since they don't have feathers yet, we have to provide supplemental temperature for them. So one of the things that you want to try to do for these birds is when they start and they're tiny babies, they need it to be about 90 to 95 degrees underneath the heat lamp where the chicks are. So I'll take a thermometer and I'll stick it right underneath there when I'm getting everything set up. I'll put it under there before I get the chicks. I'll make sure I've got the temperature where I want it to be. This particular room does not have any extra heat, so the heat lamp is their only source of heat. So I do monitor it very closely since I can't help control it with the actual temperature of the room. So these babies, I'll put the thermometer right underneath the heat lamp. I'll put it down here and I'll see what temperature we get to, make sure the birds are nice and comfy. These guys are probably just a little bit cooler than I would like to ideally see, because I want to see them walking all the way around. But it is quite a cold day. It's only about 40 degrees outside today, so it's a little cooler of a day. But they are starting to get around a little bit, moving outside of their warm zone, eating, drinking, and then going right back under there, underneath the heat lamp to warm back up again. But I keep the thermometer here the whole time the birds are in the brooder box because I want to make sure I'm managing this temperature correctly. Temperature should be about 90 to 95 degrees if you're using heat lamps or brooders. Check your recommendations if you're using the heat plates that mimic the mama hens, getting underneath the wings of the mama hens. They will have instructions on how to set those up. But about 90 to 95 degrees, and then I decrease the temperature in here by raising the heat lamp by about 5 degrees every week until the birds have their feathers or they reach ambient temperature. It typically takes about 3 weeks for these birds to have enough feathers where they can regulate their temperature. So I will use this heat lamp for about 3 weeks. Depending on the season, if you're raising birds in late spring, early summer, you might only need it for a week or two. If you're trying to raise birds in the winter time, you're gonna need it for the full 3, maybe even 4 or 5 weeks, just depending on how well they're feathering and how cold it is where you're brooding those chicks. So just a few things about these particular baby chicks, and then we'll move on to feed sources. I have lots of different types of birds in here. I have some barred rocks, I have some Wyandottes. I also have a couple Easter eggers, and then I have some really popular breeds that people are going after quite a bit recently. And I just want to talk a little bit about those for a second. So chickens have breed standards, just like dogs have breed standards. So a Labradoodle or a Labrador. In order to have a Labrador, there are certain standards of that breed. Hair color, the way that their conformation, all of that kind of stuff. Chickens actually have the same thing. But it's become really, really popular today to breed these birds for certain characteristics outside of the standard. For example, I have some Sapphire Gems. They're really bred to be really pretty. They're going to be really pretty adult birds. There are also some Cinnamon Queens in here. These poor little guys right here, they're the littlest of the group. But they are actually bred to be really, really good egg producers. So the single comb white leghorn is probably our best egg producer. She is a white feathered bird who lays a white egg. People want high egg production, but they want the brown egg. And so now we've crossed a lot of these standard breeds so that we can get high egg production, but the brown egg everyone's looking for. So some of these different types of breeds are those really good crosses, and they're becoming very, very popular. Very similar to like a Labradoodle or a Golden Doodle becoming very, very popular because we're breeding for these specifics from the standards to get what we want. So watch for those. They may not be standard breeds, but there are a lot of them out on the market today, and they are extremely popular. So looking at these chicks, if you're a first-time chicken keeper or you're just new to getting chicks, there are a couple things to observe about this particular group. Most of these guys are doing great. These guys over here are doing great. These guys are fairly active, eyes are open, looking around, being really observant. These 3 right here, I'm keeping a very close eye on. They are smaller than the rest. They are a different breed. These are the Cinnamon Queens. They're smaller than the rest, but they don't seem to be as active as the rest. So these three I'm actually keeping a really close eye on to make sure that they're gonna do okay. I wanna make sure in the next hour or two that I see them eating, that I see them over here at the water. I'm gonna let them relax and rest underneath the heat lamp right now. But those are just a couple things to look at. This is perfect behavior. Perfect behavior. Drinking, picking on each other, walking over here and eating. If all of your birds look like this, maybe just a little bit lethargic, not quite as active as you want them to see, then those are ones I keep a really close eye on. So I wanna make sure they're eating, I wanna make sure they're drinking, I wanna make sure that they have plenty of heat. So just some things to think about, and when you're watching your birds, most of the time your birds are going to do really great, but you will have one or two that you might have to nurse a little bit harder just because they're not quite as thrifty as the rest of them. But please put your questions in the feed, and we will definitely answer your questions as we go. We're going to walk over and take a look at some different types of feed because I know that's what you guys, a lot of you all were interested in. So let's walk over and take a look at some of the different types of feed. The feed we have in here is our new Chick House Reserve. This particular feed is a really, really beautiful, great, wholesome blend of feeds. I'll show you the bag over here in just a second. But these chicks are going to be raised on Chick House Reserve. So we'll go over here and look at it real quick. So a lot of people asked, and don't be this is my feed pile. I have a lot of chickens. You don't need this much feed, but I do have a lot of chickens. So. But a lot of you guys have asked, what do you feed the birds and when do you switch? So this is Chick House Reserve. This feed is designed to be fed from hatch until your birds start laying eggs. So from hatch to about 4 months of age, this is the only feed they need. This is the only nutrition that they need. You don't have to add anything extra to the feed. You don't have to add anything extra to the water. I didn't mention that when I was over there, but I don't add anything to my water. All they get is clean drinking water and a really high quality, complete chick starter grower, and they do great. So this feed's designed to be fed from hatch until those birds start laying eggs. We also have one of our most popular chick feeds, and I've already bought the chicks on this. They do really well also. This is our 18% start right. This is a crumble. I'll just pick it up. This is a crumble feed. So it's a really high quality crumble feed. It has lifeguard, so does Chick House Reserve. It has lifeguard in it, which is a proprietary blend of ingredients that helps focus on gut health. So it gives those birds that natural boost in immunity. So we have Chick House Reserve, our 18% start right chick feed. These are the only two I have because my birds are meant for egg production. But if you're raising turkeys or ducks or meat birds, we also have really great starter grower options for those types of birds too. So if you're interested in any of those, go to our website or send us an email or put something in the comments and we can definitely make recommendations for that. Most of our starter and grower feeds are designed to be fed from hatch until those birds lay eggs, or from hatch to harvest. So it's really the only thing you need through that entire grow out phase. Now, one thing I do want to talk about, because a lot of you guys in your questions ask this, do I need a medicated or a non-medicated feed? So one thing I think I've realized in talking to a lot of folks is there's a little bit of confusion about what a medicated feed is. Most of the medicated feeds that are on the market, and by most I mean probably 90%, are medicated for the prevention of coccidiosis. So the medication that's in that feed is usually amprolium. Amprolium works to prevent coccidiosis. So when we're talking medicated feeds, we're not talking an all-inclusive or an all-in-one medication that prevents all diseases or treats all diseases. We're talking about a medication that prevents coccidiosis. So that's just one thing to think about. You know, I've had a couple people ask, well, do I need a medicated feed when we have respiratory issues? Do I need a medicated feed when we have bumblefoot issues, you know, those types of things. The medicated feed is meant for the prevention of coccidiosis, and most of those on the market are for prevention of coccidiosis. Cocci is an intestinal protozoa, so it is a parasite, and it gets into the stomach and the gut of the birds, not really the stomach, but the gut of the birds, the hind gut of the birds, and it can cause problems in how they digest their feed. The major difficulty with cocci is it is very difficult to get rid of because it lives in the ground. So it lives in the soil, it lives in the dirt, and it's really hard. It doesn't die off with hard frosts or hard freezes or anything like that. So once you have cocci in the dirt, in the bedding, around where the birds are living, then often you can have repeat issues year after year. So a lot of people choose medicated feeds as a preventative measure. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So they choose medicated feeds in order to prevent any issues that might happen. Non-medicated feeds are also available. They're also really good choices. If you have brand new equipment, brand new chicks, brand new chicken houses, you've never had any birds out there before, then feel free to start with a good non-medicated feed. I myself actually start with non-medicated feeds. But if I were to ever have a cocci outbreak, I would definitely go with a medicated feed on my next group just as a preventative because I know how difficult it is to get rid of. So we're going to go back, take one more quick check with the chicks, look in on them, and I'll answer a couple of questions we have specifically about chicks, and then we're going to go out and show you guys how to introduce new birds to an existing flock. Okay. So Jennifer asked when you should feed grit to your chicks. So as you might have noticed, Chick House Reserve actually does have some larger pieces of whole grain. So this feed is already fortified with grit. We have grit in this formula to help the chicks digest those larger pieces. If you're feeding a regular crumble, then you probably don't need grit, but adding grit to, not adding it to their feed, but providing grit, a supplemental grit source, like on the side in a separate feed pan or in a little bowl. If the birds need it, they'll go ahead and eat it. It won't cause any harm to put it out there, but in most cases, you don't actually have to feed extra grit, but you certainly can. And if you're feeding lots of whole grains or treats or something along those lines, you probably would be a good idea to put it out there. Now, as far as treats for baby chicks are concerned, I would avoid any treats until the birds are at least 3 to 4 months old. When they're about 3 months old, they're going to be almost full size. They haven't quite reached sexual maturity yet, but they're going to be almost full size. So at about that age, they can handle treats and stuff fairly well, regulate their feed. But before that, I would avoid it because they are growing rapidly in those first few weeks. And you want to make sure you're giving them a balanced, complete diet when they're growing so rapidly. Okay. Next question is, what's the best way to prevent pasty bottom? Okay, pasty bottom is what happens when the chicks get, I don't want to handle you too much, but you're a great example. Pasty bottom is what happens when the chicks get stuff that's stuck to the bottom of their vent, which is where all the manure comes out. So pasty bottom is usually caused by stress. When these chicks hatch, they actually don't have much of an immune system or a digestive tract developed. Mammals can get innate immunity from their mother during gestation. They also get antibodies from colostrum, the first milk, but chicks don't really get that advantage. So since they have really immature immune systems and they can get easily stressed, they can be prone to pasty bottom. Pasty bottom happens usually when there's big fluctuations in the temperature, so it's exacerbated by stress. So if the birds get too chilled in shipping, if the temperature swings too much, it gets too cold or too hot during the day, it swings too much, it's not a comfortable level, they can be more prone to pasty bottom. It usually clears itself up in about 7 to 10 days because that digestive tract has started to mature. Now they can properly digest feed. So it starts to clear itself up after a few days. but it is something you want to watch for. We just got these baby chicks yesterday. A couple of them I did have to clean pasty butts off of. But hopefully in the next day or two with good quality feed and water, that will clear itself up. So just something to watch out for. They usually do grow out of it, but you do have to clean them off to make sure that they can properly defecate. Okay, and the next question is, when is it okay to move them outside to the coop? So I think that's a perfect transition to going outside, and I'll show you guys what to do next. So these babies will stay in here, in this room, in this brooder box with this same setup for about 2 weeks, depending on the temperature. I usually know it's time to move them when they start jumping up on the sides. Because when they start jumping up on the sides, they're going to jump out and they're not going to be able to get back in. And if they can't get back under their heat lamp or in their heat source, then that could cause them to get too chilled or to die. So as soon as they usually tell me when it's time for them to move out, when they start trying to jump up here on the sides. So we're going to go out to the coop now, and we're going to check out the setup out there and how we transition the new babies to the existing flock. Oh, no, no, no. That's Wheezy the cat. She wants the chicks. How much time have we gone? 24? Okay, that's good. Guys were here on the last meetings. You probably saw the coop. The nice thing about this coop, when we built it, it was an old calf barn, and then it was a dog kennel. Now it's a chicken coop, and when we modified it, we made it so we could divide it into 8 different individual pens if we wanted to. At first I only had 1, and then I was like, well, now I have to have 2. So I only had this side. Then I decided I had to have this side too. And then once I had 2 pens, I needed to be able to divide them in that too. So it kind of evolved because I do so many different things. If I want to get ducks, if I want to get chicks, if I want to separate birds. But now we have it set up where we can have 8 different pens if we want to. Right now I have 3, and I'll show you kind of why I have 3. So it is spring, so everything's still pretty wet, but our grass is greening up pretty good down here. So the chickens all go out there and peck around in the grass, but it is pretty wet most of the time since it's springtime. So introducing new birds to an existing flock. My existing flock is in here now. I'm going to let them out so I can kind of show you guys how I do it. But the first thing I'm going to show you is the setup I have right here. Oh no, bird. So if you come in here, I have some barriers between the existing birds that are in here and this little pen. When the babies move out of the brooder box, they're going to move into this little pen. So I have this so that the existing birds cannot get in here, but the babies are going to come in here, and this is going to be where they live until they go outside with the rest of the flock. So at about 2 weeks old, they'll come in here. We'll put down feeders, waters, depending on the temperature. I may have to move a heat lamp in here. I hope not, but I may have to. It's just going to depend on the season and how it goes and their feathering and everything. But this is where they will come as soon as they move out of the brooder box. So this is their transition house, kind of. And the nice thing about having that separate pen is that those chicks are going to be raised beside these birds. So they're going to know each other. They're going to be familiar with each other, but they can't really get to each other. And that's going to help a good bit when we introduce the existing flock or when we introduce the new birds to the existing flock. So I'll let these guys out too. This pen has ducks in it too, so you see the ducks waddle their way out. So what happens when we introduce the new chicks to the existing flock? I let the existing flock, of course, live beside the new baby chicks. But in addition to that, I let them out to free range all day long. And when the new babies are old enough, what I will do is these guys will be out free ranging, and about an hour before it's time for the birds to go back on their roosts, I will let the new babies out. So about an hour before sundown, when the new babies are about 12 weeks old or so, I will open their door. I don't want any others going there. I will open their door and I will let them come out. And I'll let them free range around with the existing flock. And what they're going to do is they're going to be really shy, and they're just going to stand in the door at first and not want to come out. Then when they do come out, they're going to kind of stick together, you know, as their own little flock. And then the rest of these guys are going to stick together as their own little flock. The rest of these guys are probably going to want to stick together as their own little flock too. They'll be aware of each other, but they're not going to be around each other too much. And then when they go in at night, they'll go back into their respective pens. Now, I'll increase that time, so maybe it's an hour the first day. Maybe it's 2 hours the second day. Maybe it's 3 hours the fourth day. So I'll just start to increase the time that the new babies are allowed outside. And remember, when I say babies, these guys are probably about 12 weeks old. So they're about 3 months old, maybe 2, depending on the season. But what you don't want is to have your new chicks be so small that if the older chicks were to pick on them, it wouldn't be a fair fight. So I like to get them at least about 12 weeks old if I'm going to let them all out together. So I'll let the new babies out, and then slowly but surely the two flocks will kind of start to get closer and closer together, start to integrate with each other. And it's really a nice, gentle way to get the two flocks together. It does take some time, and it does take the setup so that you can raise them separately. They're aware of each other, they can see each other, but they can't get to each other. If those aren't options, I do have some other tips and some things that you can try. First, if you get new birds and they're adult birds, you want to make sure you keep them separate. So you keep those new birds separate from your existing flock so that you can observe them for signs of disease. Do I need to move out of the sun? Yeah. Okay. So you can observe them for signs of disease. You want to make sure you're not bringing something into your existing flock. So you want to keep them separate if you can. 2 weeks minimum, a month is actually far more ideal. Observe the birds. Make sure you don't see any signs of disease. Then when you bring them together, you don't want to take new birds and just throw them in with your existing flock, especially if they don't have a lot of room to roam. If they're in a small coop or if they're in a small run, if you go in the middle of the day and you just throw new birds in there, then they're going to start fighting and going to start trying to establish a pecking order. So you don't want to do that. If you can, keep them separate. If you can build a temporary partition, or you can put them in like a larger dog kennel or something so you can keep them separate, that would be the best thing to do. If you cannot do that, then one of the things you might want to try to do is put them in the coop at night. So not during the day, not when it's brightest, but put them in there at night. And then in the morning when they wake up, they're like, was she here? Was she not here? I'm not sure. And it helps those new birds be accepted into the flock without a really hard time trying to establish a new pecking order. Roosters also help with establishing or bringing new birds into the flock, because roosters might be the first ones to go over and extend their welcome to the new hens. So they are curious about the new hens that you're adding, so they'll go over and check them out first before some of your older hens will. But For the most part, if you have the opportunity to raise them separate like I will in here, so they'll just be separated by a small screen from this group, and then slowly but surely let them free range together. That helps a lot in getting the two flocks together as one group. And then eventually what I will do is I'll remove this partition, this screen, and so they'll just be one large group over here, one large group over there, and at nighttime they can feel free to go into whichever coop side they want to, but they usually go to the one where they were raised. So let's do a couple more questions, but that's generally speaking the best ways to raise chicks and to introduce new chicks to an existing flock. So let's do some of our questions. So Stephen asks, when feeding medicated chick starter, is it necessary to also provide probiotics and electrolytes in the water? So as I mentioned when we were inside looking at the brooder box, chick starter, the medication in that is specific for prevention of coccidiosis. So the electrolytes and the probiotics actually have totally different functions. They work in totally different ways. So the probiotics and electrolytes, I don't put anything in my water. I don't put any electrolytes in my water. I just do fresh, clean drinking water. That's it. Mr. Rooster's going to strut around here. Fresh, clean drinking water. That's it. But feel free to, you can use electrolytes if you want to. They're just extra vitamins and some extra minerals that the birds need. So you can use them, but you don't have to. But they do work in totally different ways. So just by providing medicated feed, you are not providing electrolytes or vitamins and minerals. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Wynette asks, which is better, brown eggs or white eggs, and which chicks would provide the best eggs? So actually, nutritionally speaking, there is no difference in a brown egg and a white egg. What are you doing? What are you doing? You're knocking my broom down. She's very, very curious. Nutritionally speaking, there's no difference in a brown egg and a white egg. So if your hens are fed the same feed and you have a brown egg layer and a white egg layer, then those two eggs have the same nutritional profile. So don't choose egg color based on you think one's healthier than the other. They are not. But you can change the nutrition of an egg by changing what you feed those hens. She is extremely curious. And if I have my basket of eggs over here, I have to be really careful about her. It's the barred rock in the back. If I have my basket of eggs in here, she will jump up there and knock it over. So I have to make sure as soon as I collect my eggs, I take them back to the house, because if I leave them here, they'll be all broken when I get back. So it's her, for sure. Okay. Terry asks, what should I feed chicks at different stages of their life, or hens in general? So most of us who have backyard birds are going to see 3 different types of feed: starter feeds, grower feeds, and layer feeds. Most of our starter and grower feeds are together as one group, so it's a starter grower feed. It makes feeding really simple. You don't have to worry about switching feeds. So usually you're going to feed your starter grower, and Kalmbach will usually have a starter grower combo from the time those birds hatch until the time they're ready to lay eggs, which is about 4 months. And at 4 months or 16 weeks, you'll switch them to a layer feed, any complete layer feed. The biggest difference for a layer feed is that it has enough calcium for those birds to lay really high quality eggs. Okay, so Tara asks, should I feed a medicated chick feed as a preventative, or only feed medicated feed if chicks show signs of cocci? And can silkies be fed medicated feed? So the answer is yes, silkies can be fed medicated feed. Come on. Where are you going? You want to go out? Go with me? I'm gonna lock them out and see if I can prevent prevent that. So yes, silkies can eat medicated feed, And then, so most medicated feeds are meant for prevention of cocci. There are water treatments. So if you do have a cocci outbreak, you can switch to a medicated feed, or you can get a water treatment. If you've ever had a cocci outbreak in the past, then I would recommend going with a preventative medicated feed for your chicks on your next couple flocks. It does help. It does work. Those medications do work really well. So if you've ever had a problem in the past, go ahead and do the preventative. Okay, the next question comes from Melissa. She asks, what do you use for your poultry litter? I've used paper towels and puppy pads in the past. I use pine shavings. I use pine shavings for my adult birds and for my chicks. We can come in here and look. But we put down pine shavings in the chicken coop. I put it down in the brooder box. Pine shavings are my favorite because they absorb a lot of moisture. When the birds poop in here, I will turn over these shavings every day. When we're ready to clean out, they compost very, very well. So we just actually spread them on our hay fields. So pine shavings are my favorite because of ease of use when they're young and when they're in the no, don't pick on this. No, duck eggs. Ducks lay on the floor. So pine shavings are, I find them the most absorbent, the easiest to use. And then for us, because we're interested in composting them, using them as fertilizer basically for our fields, they are really good at breaking down composting, and we can use them from that aspect too. We don't just have to throw it in the trash. So those are some of the big advantages. That's my favorite. There's sand, straw, hay. If you have easy or good access to straw or hay, you can certainly use that as well. No problems with those. So any of these types of things work really, really well. Okay. Melissa also asks, when is it okay to move your birds outside to the coop? So you want to do it when the birds have their feathers. That's usually about 3 weeks. So, very, very good guideline is to wait until your birds are about 3 weeks old to move them outside to their coop. That will vary a little bit with age and breed, but for the most part, 3 weeks is the perfect time for that. Sorry. Okay. Kayla asks, how much do I handle them to keep them friendly and not scared of people? When they're really small babies, like what we saw in the brooder box, you don't want to handle them very often. Handling is stressful for the babies. Plus, they can get cooled off, a little bit too cooled off. You want them to stay nice and warm underneath that heat lamp. So I try not to handle mine very often. I try not to let my kids go in there and pet them or pick them up too often until they're about 2 or 3 weeks old. At that point, they're a lot bigger, hardier, and they already have some of their feathers, so it's a little less stressful for them. These birds I don't handle too often. I do handle some of them. Like that one down there, that's my oldest bird in the flock. She's about 8. I pick her up all the time because I get her down off the roost because I feel bad for her because she's old. But I don't handle them too often, but they'll run to you. You can kind of train them to come to you, and you can pick them up with scratch or treats or Hen House Reserve. They love Hen House Reserve. So if you throw Hen House Reserve down, they'll run right up to you. And then if you do that fairly often, when they hear your voice, they're going to run right up to you. So I would handle them just when you're feeding them, touch them. They won't be scared of you, especially if when you're around, it means food source. They're really going to be really friendly with you. Okay, so Jessica had a question. She had some broody hens who tried to hatch. She had a broody hen who had 3 eggs that didn't hatch. The chicks tried to get out of the egg, but they didn't make it out. So there are a number of things that can cause that to happen. If the egg is not rotated properly, then the chicks can actually grow into the side of the eggshell, so they can't physically get separated from it. If the temperature, the humidity is not right, or the humidity is too high, and there's too much moisture inside the eggshell when they start to pip out, that can cause problems. Or if it's too low, that can also cause problems. Usually broody hens are pretty good at regulating that themselves, but there are a number of different reasons why that would happen. Cat. She can hear my voice, so she's coming. So you just want to make sure when you have those broody hens, they're not going to use it very often. They're not going to get down and drink a lot of water. They're not going to get down and eat a lot of feed. But you do want to keep that available to them just in case, and then you can usually regulate fairly well. Okay. So Dan asks, should I be adding any vitamins to their water, and should I be giving them medicated chick starter? And is it okay to add different age chicks to the same brooder? So like I said, I don't personally add anything to their water. Clean, fresh drinking water is all I do, but you certainly can. Those are really good vitamin sources and some mineral sources, so you can do that, but you don't have to, because a good quality complete feed will have all of that in it already. Medicated chick feed, I think we've covered that one fairly well. Adding different age chicks to the same brooder. You can do that, especially if you're brooding with zones. So you have your warm zone where your very young birds are going to hang out, and then your birds that can handle 5 or 7 degrees cooler can get out of the really warm zone. But you probably don't want to do that if your birds hatch any more than about 5 or 7 days difference. I would say that's probably where you want to cut off. You don't want 7-day-old chicks, and 1-day-old chicks is probably the max I would have in a brooder of different ages. Okay, Sue asks, no, this is April, I'm sorry. April asks, how long do chicks need a heat lamp? That depends on the temperature. So they need a heat lamp until they have their feathers. That's usually about 3 to 4 weeks of age. And it also depends on the temperature. So if you're raising birds in the middle of summer, they might not need the heat lamp during the middle of the day at all. And I have actually had that happen before, where I only have to plug it in at night, and then during the day it's 90, 95 degrees, and they don't need any supplemental heat. But it really just depends on the temperature and when they get their feathers. About 3 weeks. Okay, Melanie asks, housing multiple poultry together safely? Guineas, peacocks, chickens, turkeys, is it possible, or do you need separate enclosures? It is possible. So as you see, I have some ducks in here. I don't know where my ducks went. Usually they go off by themselves, but I have some ducks in here with these chickens. The main thing you want to be aware of is blackhead and turkeys. So chickens can be carriers of histomonas, which is what causes blackhead, but they are asymptomatic carriers. So they don't have any disease symptoms. They don't get sick. Turkeys, on the other hand, can get that histomonas from chickens, and they get very sick. So I don't recommend raising turkeys and chickens together if you can avoid it. It's one of those things where they may or may not be carriers, but you don't really know, so I just avoid it. Or if I'm ever going to raise turkeys in the same place where I've had chickens, I make sure I clean really, really well. Clean everything out, take all of your equipment out, sanitize, so spray down with bleach water, sanitize everything, and make sure it's really good and clean before you're going to start raising turkeys where chickens have been. Okay, the last thing I want to cover today is Julie and a couple other people, roosters back there. Julie and a couple people asked to touch on the recent avian influenza outbreak. So if you're not aware, in the United States, we recently had a high pathogenic avian influenza outbreak. Avian influenza is a virus, it's a viral disease. Birds can get it. Usually they get it either from transfer, so people bring the virus or dander with the virus that's on it into the coop or into a new location, or they can get it from wild birds. Wild birds are often carriers. In fact, when you look at avian influenza outbreaks across the U.S., they follow migratory bird patterns. So most of them are actually started from migratory bird Passover. So a couple things to keep in mind if you are concerned about avian influenza. Do not feed wild birds if you have backyard chickens. So I know having bird feeders up and feeding wild birds is really, really fun and is a great thing to watch. But if you have backyard birds, you don't want to be inviting wild birds onto your property with bird feeders. If you do have bird feeders, you need to make sure that they are nowhere where your chickens can get to. So a bird feeder in your front yard, your chickens, if they're free ranging, can go out there and they're going to peck around and pick up the stuff that the birds spill, and they're going to come in contact with the manure from the wild birds, and that's how it can be transferred. So avoid feeding wild birds if you have backyard chickens. Another thing you want to make sure to do is not share equipment, housing, cages, feeders, waters. You don't want to share that with any other flocks. Just in case another flock might have it, you could transfer the virus on that equipment to your flock. You want to make sure you clean and sanitize your equipment really, really well. And then don't share it with other people. So if you're buying birds from someone else, take your own cage to get the birds, keep them quarantined, all that kind of stuff to watch over them. One of the other things you can try to do is make sure on your shoes that your shoes are dedicated to going to your chicken coop. So I was talking to a lady the other day and she said she had her barn Crocs and her dress Crocs. So that's a pretty popular thing to do. These shoes I wear only around my chicken coop. I have other shoes that I'll wear other places, but these are really just for my chicken coop. I try not to go out anywhere where I've seen like wild geese out in the field. If I go out into that field, I'll make sure that I sanitize my shoes or I wear different shoes before I come into my flock. And then if you can, just avoid other flocks. So avoid other flocks going and visiting and handling other chickens and then coming directly back to your birds. You want to make sure when you come back to your birds that you shower, change clothes, all those things to prevent disease from transferring. So signs of avian influenza, the birds will be generally very lethargic, very tired, won't want to stand up, won't want to move around. They can have swollen combs and wattles and swollen around their eyelids. Interesting symptom of avian influenza is they will suddenly start laying shellless or soft-shelled eggs. And then mortality is usually very high. So within the next 2 or 3 days, you'll start to lose birds kind of unexpectedly. You won't really realize they're sick, and then all of a sudden you'll start losing birds, and that's one of the main signs of avian influenza. So just something to be aware of and watch your birds and symptoms of. But if you go on the USDA's website, they actually have a really nice tracker which shows you where current outbreaks are. The East has kind of slowed down a little bit. It's more in the Midwest now, but it's still in pretty much quite a few states. I mean, over a dozen states, I think, in the U.S. so far this year. So that's it for questions. We're going to take one last look around the coop, and we'll go out and look at the baby birds one more time. And please put any other questions that you have in the chat, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. So we'll just do a quick tour around, see the coop, and we'll walk back and see the babies, and then take your questions. I'm a little heavy on roosters right now. I have 4 roosters. So, it's not ideal. I'm hoping in this new group I don't end up with any roosters. Usually when they come sexed, they're about 90% accurate. So if you get 10 chicks, they're usually pretty accurate. At about 9, you might end up with 1 rooster. I'm hoping I don't now because these guys are, I have 3 that look just like that and the white one. And then I have a broody hen who's a really strong broody hen. And for some reason, she seems to be very good at hatching out male chicks. I thought you guys would get to see her. So she was sitting on her, she was sitting yesterday. And I thought we would get to see her be broody, and I was going to show her to you because when I tried to add new shavings to the nesting box yesterday, she nipped at me. So I was like, oh, she's sitting already. But when I went to lock them up last night, she was up on the roost. So I guess it was just threatening behavior, not really. She just didn't want new shavings in the nesting box. Worried about you, little one. So, but there are a couple of them I'm gonna keep a real close eye on, but I'm glad to see that one out drinking water. That was one that I was watching pretty close. That's okay. So I'm glad to see her out there. Oh, it's okay.
But I guess we'll cut it off there. And Nancy, I just can't believe we are so thankful for everything you've shared. And we love seeing all of the activity and at your coop, and all of the chickens is wonderful. I think there are a couple of additional questions that we need to answer, and we're going to give away a couple more prizes. I want to give everybody who's here a couple more minutes to submit your questions. So in the meantime, I'm going to just do a quick little screen share so that you can see a little bit more about the Kalmbach Feeds website and some resources that are available to you. There's a lot of opportunity to learn even more. This is our homepage at kalmbachfeeds.com. And then if you go to learn more about chickens, there are all kinds of articles that Nancy has written, most of them, that are available for you all the time. And so I saw somebody asking about preparing for winter. There is a winterizing your chicken coop article there. And so there's all kinds of resources available 24/7. And then finally, there's, if you look at, we have a full line of poultry products for whatever types of birds, life stages, etc., that you've got. And then where to buy. You can use our dealer locator to find where your closest dealer or retailer is. We are also available on Chewy and Amazon if you don't happen to be located close to a dealer. We are working on getting better distribution, and yeah, I think you'd be very pleased to get access to the Kalmbach Feeds products. So I'll turn it over to Nancy to answer additional questions that came in while we were watching her coop and all the crazy chickens.
Yes, thank you, Bonnie. Yes. Yeah, Bonnie sent me, I'm going to tattle on her here. She sent me a private message during it and said that she thinks I'm becoming a crazy chicken lady. And I said, yes, it's absolutely true. I'm wearing chicken earrings. So I have tons of chicken t-shirts, all that stuff. So yes, of course, it happens. So I thank you guys very much for sticking with us through the seminar. I really appreciate it. I was happy to invite everyone to see how I raise my birds personally, talk about the different Kalmbach feeds. And now we're going to answer some of the questions that we got as the seminar progressed. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to try to answer every one of them if I can. So Chris and Julie said, could you provide more info on nursing baby chicks who are not as active as some of the others? So one of the things I make sure that I do when I have a couple of chicks who just don't seem as thrifty, I make sure that they're eating and I make sure they get water. So one of the first things I'll do is I will dip their beaks in the water just a little bit so they can get some of that water on their beaks and around and into their mouths, just to make sure that they understand that that is their water source. The next thing I try to do is not handle them very often. I make sure they're underneath their heat lamp. They're getting plenty of heat so they can stay nice and good and warm, and then really observe them. So I go back out and I check on them every half hour, every 15 minutes, just to make sure that they look fairly good. Most of the time when they're very, very young, they're going to bounce back if they can get some feed or they can get some water. It's very common for people to add electrolytes to their water in those cases. I do not add anything to my water, but if I had some that I was really, really concerned about, I would. Another thing people have done is to do like sugar water. So it can give them some energy, some nutrition. And that I've done that in the past. I've had to do that in the past, and that has worked fairly well. Just an update, since we did record yesterday on those chicks, they all did really well. So I did go back after we were finished, dip their beaks in the water, put them under the heat lamps. And then after a little while, I could start to see them perk up a little bit. And then later they were in their feed. And so everybody's doing great. You can't even tell that they were a little bit behind all the other ones. So those are just a couple of things you can do to help nurse them. Okay, let's see. Richard says, how often do you change the shavings? We were doing it daily, but moved to a larger bin today. I actually don't change them at all. So they're in the brooder box for 2 weeks and they're on the same shavings for 2 weeks, just about. And then once they go out into the main coop, I only clean that out about 4 times a year, once a season. What I do every day is when I go out there, I kind of turn the shavings over and mix the manure down in. I use pine shavings, which absorb a lot of moisture, and you want to make sure that the bedding is at least 2 inches thick. If the bedding's 2 inches thick, then you've got a nice, good, soft bed for the birds, and you can turn it over fairly well and fairly easy. Work that manure down into it. Okay. Tori asks, is Chick House Reserve a crumble? Chick House Reserve is actually a textured feed. So Bonnie answered that one really well right below. It's a mix of seeds, vegetables, different types of grains, and it has a nutritious crumble in it, which has a lot of its fortification and some other nutrients. So it has a crumble component, but it's a lot more than just a crumble. Emily asks, when to introduce chicks to the rest of the adult flock, what do you feed them? Since I house them separately, I feed my chicks a starter grower and my layers a layer feed. If you have to feed them the same feed, if you bring them together and feed them the same feed, go with a good grower feed or a good maintenance feed when the birds are 3 months or so older for everyone, with a calcium source like oyster shell or limestone chips on the side. You want to avoid feeding a complete layer feed to really young chicks. I wouldn't introduce a layer feed to birds that are any younger than 16 weeks is really where you want to be. I wouldn't do it any younger than 12 weeks. At 12 weeks is pushing it, but 12 weeks probably be okay. But any younger than that, you definitely don't want those birds to be on layer feed. There's too much calcium for them. So go with something different until they're all at least 16 weeks old, and then everybody gets to go on layer feed. Okay, so 19044 asks, when can the baby chicks be put outside in their coops? When they have their feathers. So that's usually about 3 weeks. I'll put mine out in the coop at 2 weeks. I may or may not have to put a heat lamp out there. I don't have the best setup in that workshop for keeping them in there for any longer than about 2 weeks, because they start to jump out of the brooder box, and that's even more dangerous. So I'll move them outside at about 2 weeks, but they'll stay locked up. I won't let them go outside. If I didn't have any other chickens, if this was the first time I had chickens or the only flock I had, I wouldn't let them go outside until they were about 3 weeks old, until they had their feathers. Because I have existing chickens, I actually don't let mine go outside with my existing chickens until they're about 12 weeks old. If I keep my existing flock locked in the coop, then I'll let my new birds out at about 3 weeks when they have their feathers. So Misty says, if it stays warm, can you put the chicks out at 6 weeks instead of 8? Yes, you can even put them out even earlier than that. I'll let them go outside if it's warm at about 3 weeks. Okay, Kara asks, I have some chicks coming that are vaccinated and I got some that were not vaccinated. If I need to give medicated feed, is it fine to pull those non-vaccinated chicks out and feed them separately? Sure, you can do that. Anytime that you're going to introduce or you pull your birds apart and you put them back together, sometimes they'll have to work out their pecking order again. So just be prepared for that. They also make water treatments. So if you can separate them where you can do water treatments for if you have a cocci outbreak, you might want to consider that. But for the most part, you should be able to feed them the same thing. I think you'll probably be okay. Dan asks, how much space do the chicks need? Indoor space for the type of birds I have, which are good standard breed, dual purpose birds, is about 1.5 square feet per bird. I give them far more than that, just because I feel like the more space, the better for the birds. They don't fight as much, it's cleaner, those kinds of things. So at least 1.5 square feet per bird. Outdoor space, about 10 square feet per bird. Ooh, Catherine has a good question. How do you teach your dog not to attack your chickens? So I have been very blessed. I have 3 dogs, actually. Remy, the white one, was the only one you saw, but there were 2 others. And none of my dogs seem to bother my chickens. So when I have the birds and they're very young, I do work with them, feeding them, watering them, talking to them, sitting with them. And the dogs are with me when I do that. And so they seem to see that these chickens belong there. And so they don't bother them. And I do keep a close eye when I first let them out to make sure that the dogs are going to be good and not bother anybody, but they generally don't. You saw a few of my cats. I also have cats. When the birds get big, the cats won't bother them because they're too big. But when they're babies, I do have to make sure I keep the cats away from them. Is Chick House Reserve medicated? Chick House Reserve is not medicated. We do not have a medicated option there. We do have our 18% Start Right chick feed. That one is available in non-medicated, medicated, and non-GMO. So we have 3 options for that one. Kara says, we have well water, and right now we're giving them water from inside the house that's filtered. The only issue with our well water is it's high in iron. Do you think there'd be any problem with that? Probably not. It depends on how high in iron the water is. But if it's just generally where it's the type of high iron water where it turns your laundry a yellow color, you'll probably be fine for your birds. But what I would suggest doing is not switching them right away, because the taste or the difference in the smell might, in the taste, and birds don't have great sensory as far as smell and taste is concerned, but it still might be enough to put them off of drinking the water. And so what I would do at first is try to slowly transition them over. So 3/4 of the water has your water from inside the house, and 1/4 of it is the well, and then slowly but surely you increase that. Okay, Dan says, I've noticed that not all hens lay eggs. Why is that? If you're talking on generally a given day, let's say you have 10 hens and you only get 8 eggs, that's probably just something in the cycle of the birds, which is why you're a little bit off. You're not getting 1 egg from every bird every day. But if you notice that you have some birds that just don't seem to ever lay eggs, I find it really, really helpful if I can troubleshoot for chickens to think about egg production for what it is. That egg production is reproduction. So just like any other animal, sometimes we have poor reproducers. Let's say we have a cow that just never seems to have a calf, or we have a ewe that just never seems to have a lamb. The same thing can happen with chickens. Something is wrong in their cycle. They're just not great reproducers. And so that could happen on occasion. You just have one bird who's not a good reproducer. And if she's not going to be laying eggs. So that does happen on occasion. But generally that's what it is. It's just one bird who's just not a very good reproducer. Okay, Kara asks, if you have multiple roosters and want to pull certain breeds to breed them, how long do you need to isolate the hens? 3 weeks. So hens actually are pretty good at holding on to rooster semen for quite a long time. In fact, 10 days would probably be okay. But if you want to make absolutely sure that the only possible sire for those new chicks is the rooster you choose, then 3 weeks is how long you want to keep the hens away from them. Okay, so Gabriella asked about pine shavings. I've mentioned that a few times, that pine shavings are my absolute favorite. It's just what I prefer it because they absorb a lot of moisture. They're easy for me to clean out. They're not real heavy. So that's some of the reasons why I prefer it. Plus, we spread our manure. We have cattle as well. And so we spread our manure on our hay fields, and pine shavings compost really well. They spread really well and break down really well. So it's a good way for me to get another use out of them without actually just throwing it in the trash. So that's why I choose that particular type of bedding. There are lots of really great options out there. That's just the one that I choose to use. So Heather asks, does it matter what temperature the garage is? Of course, there's a heat lamp or a heat plate in the brooder, but our garage gets really cold. It doesn't necessarily matter. So in the beginning of the video, I'm in a room in an equipment shed, which does not have any heat source. It was about 40 degrees that day. It was probably only about 45 inside that room. But since I had the heat lamp, the chicks were doing really, really well. So that's most important. If the most important thing to consider is, can you properly manage the heat in the brooder box? Outside of the brooder box, it doesn't matter. It's properly managing the temperature inside that's most important. So Kara also asks, what are your thoughts on fermenting feed for chicks? So I actually don't recommend fermenting feeds, mostly because when you get things wet, there's the chance that mold can develop, and mold and mycotoxins, which are a byproduct of mold, and you can't smell them, you can't see them, are very dangerous. And so the possibility that you might have mold growth or mycotoxin proliferation, for me, isn't worth the benefit of fermenting feed. So I actually don't recommend it, and especially not for chicks, because they are very vulnerable. Their immune systems, their digestive tracts aren't very mature yet. So I would avoid that, especially for chicks. Okay, how long is the quarantine for new birds for avian flu? 30 days is a good quarantine level. If your birds have avian flu, high pathogenic avian flu, though, you will know pretty quickly. You'll know within 2 or 3 days. But 30 days is generally a very good guideline for quarantine. Vicky asks, what is a good age to introduce veggies and fruits? So I would not do that any earlier than about 12 weeks of age. Those first few weeks, those birds are growing rapidly. So those first 3 months or so, they are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's a good idea to stick with your complete balanced feed so that you know they have good, proper nutrition at that time, and to avoid any of the extras until they're about 3 months old. If you can wait until they're adults, which would be somewhere around 4 to 5 months, that's even better, but I definitely wouldn't do it until they're any earlier than 3 months. Okay, so Tori asks, how do you winterize your coop? Bonnie did show a really good article about winterizing your coop. All I do, I don't have any heat inside that coop in the winter. So it is just whatever the ambient outside temperature is. But there are screens and doors. I have all of those doors, all of those openings, the ventilation openings, all close in the winter. So check out that article. I actually do talk about that quite a bit, but all I do in the winter is close my openings and my ventilation. I make sure to keep some ventilation all year long. And I think I talk about that in that particular article. You still need ventilation in the wintertime, even if it's cold air, you still need good air transfer. But I do close the windows, the doors, the screens, and everything at nighttime so the birds have a chance to stay warm and don't have any drafts. Okay, Vicki asks, what age do you provide the big mineral blocks? Once again, that's about 3 to 4 months of age. Any earlier than that, you probably want to avoid it. I think we have 14 weeks on the instructions, so about 3 to 4 months. Okay, Carrie asks, what do you do to prevent pasty butt? So we talked about pasty butt in the beginning of the seminar. One of the things that exacerbates that is stress. And so managing the temperature in your brooder box goes a really long way in making sure and keeping those birds from having really bad pasty bottom. Another thing you want to do is clean it off. If you see it, actually you have to clean it off if you see it, or it can get really bad. So you want to make sure you clean all of that off, and then a really good high quality feed that really gets that digestive tract going, gets those enzymes starting to produce and excrete, and digesting feed helps for that too. But really reducing the stressors for the birds is the most important way you can prevent pasty bottom. And Bonnie says they'll provide a link to view the recording on Facebook, so you can go back and you can see where we discussed that at the very beginning. Okay, Chad says, any advice to stop them from picking through the feed and only getting what they like? So sure. We've definitely had a couple of people ask us that question. So one of the things I do, I haven't had that problem with the chicks, but one of the things I will sometimes have that problem with the adult birds. They really go after the stuff they like first. For example, in Hen House Reserve, when I throw it out at first, if I look back 5 minutes later, I don't have a single sunflower seed. My birds love the sunflower seeds. But one of the things I do is all poultry feeds, or the vast majority of poultry feeds, are designed to be fed what we call ad libitum. So the birds have access to the feed at all times. I am finding a lot of people are starting to feed their chickens in like they do their pets, which is in meals, but that's not really how poultry feeds are designed to be fed. They're designed to be in a feed pan with a hopper and available to the birds at all times. So one of the things I do is I don't fill up the feed pan or the hopper until they've cleaned up all of the feed. So I'm kind of forcing them to clean up everything. And then usually if you give it a day or two, maybe 3 days, they'll start to self-regulate really, really well. And you'll notice they are eating all the different components. Even if they're eating the really good stuff first, they're still eating the balanced diet, kind of like going to the dessert table first, but then you go back and you get your fruits and vegetables. Eventually, they're going to do that too.
Nancy, while you're reading the next questions, I will set up the first door prize so you can give yourself a chance to catch up. Okay. So, so here's how it works. If everybody, I need to put my video on. If you want to participate and win a bag of Chick House Reserve for yourself, we'll ship it directly to you. Here's how it works. I'm going to ask a question based on the content of the webinar, and the first 3 people to answer it correctly will get a free bag of Chick House Reserve. Now, ideally, if you submit your answer and type your email address in there, we'll make sure we can get a hold of you and get your shipping address. So answer the question and give us your email address at the same time. So the first question, is everybody ready? And you're going to do that through chat. The first question is, what does straight run mean? First 3 people who submit correct answers with their email addresses will get. Okay, so lots of answers coming in. I think we've probably got 3 correct answers, and we will turn it back to you, Nancy, for your next answer to your questions.
Sure. Okay, so Chris and Julie ask, do you give your adult birds treats like cut up meat, hot dogs, tuna, wet cat food, or is that a no-no? I don't give them any wet cat food. I don't give them any of that. I do give them all my kitchen scraps. So if that includes meat, leftover hot dogs, tuna, anything like that, I will give that to them. But I make sure to keep it at less than about 10% of their daily feed intake. So I don't do a lot of it, just a little bit here and there, but not every day. Any tips on preventing sour crop? Just a couple things. Fresh, clean water. Make sure it's fresh, make sure it's clean, make sure the birds have access to it at all times. Clean your waters pretty good. I don't add anything to my water. So no apple cider vinegar, no probiotics, no vitamin mineral packs, nothing like that. Just fresh, clean drinking water. How do you know when a chick has internal parasites? So oftentimes you can actually see the parasites in the manure for the birds.
Did you see me playing outside?
Yep, come here. I'm sorry. Mommy's on a webinar. You can actually see the parasites in the manure of the birds. So that's one of the ways you'll know. Also, if your birds just seem lethargic or sick, you can definitely take those birds to or a manure sample to your vet, and your vet can test that manure sample, see if you do have worms or parasites in that. So let's see, I think, is that it? Did I get all the questions?
Got all the questions? Okay. I have one more.
Okay.
Okay, and so Nancy talked a lot about how amazing chicks are and all the things that they can do to survive on their own when they're hatched without a mother's presence. And so what is the one thing that Nancy said that chicks cannot do? Now remember, you need to submit your email address too, but what is the one thing that Nancy said that chicks cannot do when they are hatched? All right, I'm scrolling down here. Yes, so the answer is temperature regulation, and I will go back through this chat and identify the top three correct, the first three correct winners. Wow, thank you, Nancy, for sharing your evening, for sharing your coop, for sharing your fun bird chaos with all of us.
Yes.
And we really appreciate everybody here who enjoyed the webinar and joined us. I saw some interest in having a more advanced webinar regarding show birds and how to raise them and how to feed them. And we will definitely put that into the calendar. And once again, we really appreciate it. And I hope that you have a great evening. And if you ever have any questions, reach out to Kalmbach Feeds. We're here to help you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.